The Center for Innovation in Population Health, we call it the IF Center, as in what if. Our effort is to give voice to the least privileged people in the world so that they have full voice in their care, so we can help them to change their lives. So the mission is to engineer person-centered care, to make people who receive help full partners in their care. So we use a theory called transformational collaborative outcomes management, focused on personal change, not on service delivery or access to care, focused on change, the impact of our work, and focused on using collaboration as a way of managing complexity. Starting with the assessment, what's going on in their lives, and following all the way through to system level planning so that we're using the stories of the people we serve to drive system change.
It's important that people feel like they're the center of their own care. And so person-centered care
Welcome to another episode of Connecting the Dots. My name is Mark Lardner. This is the show where we look at innovative approaches for using assessment data and translating it into meaningful metrics. I'm very excited about today's guest in our program today. We have Dr. Nathaniel Israel, who is a former TCOM Champion Award winner and the founder of the Union Point Group in San Dimas, California. He's also a seminal figure in the development of transformational collaborative outcomes management. So please help me welcome to the program, Dr. Nathaniel Israel. Hello, Nate.
Hey, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. I was able to follow up or kind of catch up with you at the TCOM conference, as I know probably a number of people watching were also able to do. But for those who weren't, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work with the Union Point Group?
Sure. What we do at Union Point Group is help systems help people. We're described by one customer as people who help you do the hard things. When we talk about hard things, what's tough is changing behavior. We have January 1st right around the corner, right? New Year's resolutions. That's tough stuff. But we're really talking about changing behavior at every level of the system. So what we work to do is to help people scope, script, and implement changes in systems and changes in the way that people approach the work that they do.
Awesome. All right. Well, in thinking though, in trying to help people change the way they approach the work, that is a big part of in child welfare systems, children's mental health systems, adult mental health systems, this kind of ongoing systems reform work, which I know you support. A good part of our TCOM group supports that as well. But what are the risks in our current approach to systems reform?
Well, I appreciate that you use the term risk, because our current approach, or how we see many systems approaching change or reform or transformation, or efforts to improve effectiveness and equity, they're not just risky approaches, they're approaches that are almost predestined to fail. And that sounds very doom and gloom. It sounds pretty terrible. But again and again, we make these enormous investments in change, in transformation, in system reboots. And yet, time and time again, what we find is after we've invested all of this effort, we don't have systems that are more timely, more responsive, more collaborative, more effective. So there's something wrong with the way that we're approaching that. And the real problem here, as much as it's frustrating for all of us as professionals involved in that, is that means that there's one more generation of kids and families who don't get access to those core building blocks of success that we often take for granted, right? They don't get access to safe and supportive home lives. They don't get access to schooling that really helps them develop critical thinking and problem solving, which are essential these days. And they don't get to find and keep a group of pro-social friends who help them be successful now and later in life. So it's not inconsequential. It's actually enormously consequential that we get this right. And we are not seeing that consistently. So,
Yeah, but
yeah,
I wonder too. I mean, to your point, that is something, right? It is. I think anyone involved in this work knows that when change is hard and change
yeah,
takes time. And I think, I used to operate under the idea that successful implementation is a bit of a myth, right? Things don't
mhm,
work right away.
yeah,
But what I found, and I think to your point, is that there are not only consequences when things don't work right away, but there's sometimes that we get stuck in this idea, well, it's not working, but it'll perhaps get better. And that you're in this ongoing process of hoping and wishing and waiting rather than saying,
yeah.
what is it actually that's kind of getting in the way of this being effective?
Yeah. And unfortunately, that becomes like a really nasty kind of loop, right? Because we have a set of habits that we think like, well, if we just tweak these habits a little bit, then they'll lead to the substantial changes that we're hoping for, right? We have our kind of ingrained ways of thinking. We have patterns of action that are comfortable for us. Um, but if we were to step back for just a second, there's a really uncomfortable truth in many systems, and that is that the ways of thinking and acting that are most comfortable for us are also the things that are perpetuating the system that's not effective or equitable.
Yeah.
And that's painful to see and hear because we come in with really good intent, right?
Right.
We start to ask, well, how do we flip that? How do we make equity? How do we make effectiveness a habit at every level of our system? And that sounds weird.
Yeah, I mean, it should be the expectation. One of the things you mentioned during your keynote at the conference was that you have an approach to trying to address this a bit, right? This open approach. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. So, when we talk about habits, what we're talking about is a consistent set of processes and tools, right? We're talking about things that we regularly do first to make sense of what's happening and what we're doing. Um, Something that engages the people that we serve and guides how we act on the information that we're getting. So we need something that actually lets us look at it differently, puts it together in a way that's actually helpful to the people who we're working with and for, um, and then gives us a direction that we should go that's likely to be helpful or more helpful. And so what we have worked to do is to try and figure out, is there a set of tactics that could help us move beyond this idea that we're going to make minor changes that we hope have big effects, or we're going to make big changes that are a risky bet. We're going to like roll the dice on this big change. So how is it that we go in with our eyes open, with clarity around what we might do, and really prime ourselves to be able to succeed with that? How do we, in fact, take everybody along with us as we go? So OPEN is it's an acronym. It's a strategy that has 4 tactics. The tactics follow the acronym. So we start with outcomes, then we move to practices. After we understand practices, we want to understand how those practices are experienced. That's the experience part. Outcomes, practices, experiences, and then I will admit, with this acronym, we had to cheat just a little bit. So our last is interventions, where we drop the I and we go straight to the end.
OPE
Every acronym breaks down somewhere.
OPE was not the acronym you were hoping it was going to be, so you switched to open. All right,
Didn't have quite the same ring. It was
not quite.
a strong runner-up, but it
All right,
became
so,
opine, and I don't want to opine. Okay.
Opine, could be another one, right? Yeah. As much fun as acronym development is, I'm wondering if you could give us an example of how this plays out, or how this works in some of the supportive kind of consulting work you've done.
Sure. So part of one of the things that's really tough when you're trying to make change is that there are certain people who are ready for change, and there are other people who are definitely not ready for change. They're invested for reasons, maybe very good reasons, in maintaining the status quo, right? And so if we're going to say, hey, we're going to make change, then we need to be really clear about what that change is and what the rationale for that change is, and the scope, exactly what it is that we're trying to accomplish here, and then how we would know that that change is actually working or not. And what we find again and again and again is that in systems, we both under-communicate and under-engage the people who we would most want to be on board with these changes. This includes both providers and families. And then as we go through the change process, many times, in fact, instead of picking up support along the way, learning, getting better, demonstrating improvement, what we pick up along the way is resistance, is a set of problems, are a series of things that don't work out quite the way that we want them to work out, right? So instead of becoming this virtuous cycle, many times our change efforts and change management becomes something that just grinds on people, and in fact becomes something that's it pulls them down even more. So we don't want to do that, right? We want to flip the script on that. We want to find a way that truly is consistent with TCOM, right? That if we're going to work towards transformation, it has to be collaborative, and it has to be outcomes driven. So with open, the first thing that we do is we flip the script on outcomes, and we start with outcomes. We make outcomes our starting point. So we start by saying, and we do that for a couple of reasons. One is we want to center this on the value that we're providing kids and families. And we want to start by saying, well, where are we at with that? Right? If as a system, 80 to 90% of the people we serve are consistently getting better, that's amazing. That's fantastic work. We should be celebrating what we're doing. If we're finding providers and agencies that are actually doing really exceptional work, we need to be celebrating that. If, in fact, however, it turns out that, well, we're not doing as well as we expected that we would do, then we want to understand what's going on with that. So we could start here, if that works, with a slide that kind of looks at system effectiveness. Here's a slide from a state, which will remain unnamed. And what they found using their TCOM tool is that about just under 60% of the kids that they served at 6 months of participation and engagement demonstrated meaningful functional improvement. And okay, so that's useful to know. But if we're going to intervene, that doesn't really tell us anything about where or how we would intervene or why we might intervene, right? So when we see our outcomes, we can start with a single metric, but then we want to understand how that is distributed. And here's that very same system, and we're looking at each one of these dots is a provider. And so what you're seeing here is a distribution of effectiveness across providers that goes from a provider for whom after 6 months, none of the kids appear to be functional improving in a way that's significant or reliable. And then you have a couple of agencies up at that top right-hand corner that seem to be doing consistently extraordinarily effective work, right? Okay.
Yeah. And so to put this in larger context, right? So this is systems that are implementing TCOM tool that allows them to understand meaningful or functional improvement in terms of reductions in needs and enhancement in strengths. That's the
It is. Yeah,
great.
that is. So, and we have just a series of metrics that were originally developed for a report suite that was required by TCOM EHR vendors or electronic record vendors for a while. That these originated from, and we've worked to better integrate the strengths portion of that into these metrics. But what we find typically with systems is that if they have difficulty improving functional and behavioral outcomes, there's also many times, though not always, difficulty also with strength development over time. So if you looked at this, what you would start to see then in terms of being able to make some sort of systems change is that those folks in the bottom left-hand corner and those folks in the top right-hand corner are at fundamentally different places when you talk about the need for change, right? And the danger with most of our systems change is that we apply it to everyone. And so the effect, we hope, is to move people towards a middle that is that's higher than where we're currently at, or that at least puts a floor under practice. But that's actually super problematic. It's super problematic because by doing that, almost inevitably, your new practice is going to have some monitoring requirements, going to have some documentation requirements, going to have some additional work that has to be done around that. And that's going to compete with the effective practices that the folks in the top right-hand corner are already engaging in.
Right.
So what you're doing is you're creating resistance from your most effective providers almost immediately. And, that is really not what we would want to do if we're actually going to make systems change. And then for folks in the bottom left-hand corner, part of what they might be telling you with their current ineffectiveness is that they're already overwhelmed by system demands. And so if you're then going to layer on a practice change and you're going to layer on additional documentation requirements for those folks, they're already underwater and you're pushing them further underwater, right? So they don't have a way to make that up. So we use a graph like this to understand where practice is at, but also to understand that not every practitioner, not every provider is the same. And so we need to understand if we're going to institute what we're going to call a systems change, we need to figure out how it's targeted and appropriate, not just for kids and families, but also for providers. So that's a big piece of why we want to start there. If we then take this information that we have, and then we want to think about how this applies in terms of an equity lens, then what we would want to do is we would want to say, well, what dimension of equity do we want to look at right here? So previously in that last slide, we're simply looking at effectiveness by provider. But what it might be masking is some variation along any of these dimensions right here, right, that you see in terms of equity. It might be that these different providers are serving people who have different characteristics that they're either better or not as well equipped to address. And so if we're to look at a system, and here we'll use their cultural group identification as the dimension of equity that we want to look at. Here's a system where we use the same basic analytic techniques, and we simply look over time for these two groups at how equitable care is. And what you see pretty quickly right here is the differences in effectiveness appear to be attributable to these differences in how effectively they're able to treat certain groups of people, right? So if you're looking at this is treatment needs, and for this top group here, group 2, their treatment needs stay essentially flat over 6 months of care. Oh, that's not what we're hoping for, right? This other group, which is majority culture youth, their treatment needs decrease substantially, almost drop 40% or more over 6 months of care, right? Those are really nice and impressive drops. But what those drops are masking is that doesn't happen for kids from all groups.
So what we're doing is we're moving from a program orientation to how kids are effectively treated in care to looking at all those youth and trying to separate them out by some demographic or race or one of those equity categories you listed earlier.
Yeah, by a characteristic that we've identified that might be meaningful, that might underlie some of the difference that we saw in that distribution previously, right? So we start to say, well, what is it that might be creating these differences? The first thing that we want to do is to say, are kids at each of these agencies being treated equally, or is there something or equitably, or is there something that might be driving inequity? And in fact, when you look at the percent of kids who are consistently improving after 6 months of care, in fact, the numbers are even starker when you look at it in terms of the percentage of kids who show improvement after six months of care. That's a 5-fold difference.
Yeah.
Which is tremendously disturbing. So we start with outcomes, right? And those outcomes give us a place to start to say, well, let's try and figure out what we need, if we need to act, and what we might act on. But they don't tell us what is it about the actual interactions, what is it about our behaviors and habits that are creating this. And I'll just roll through this really, really quickly. With any system, you can implement a lot of practices, and likely you'll implement a package of EBPs, particularly for kids who have some of the most serious concerns. Across EBPs, there are tons of fidelity indicators that they use. The problem with these fidelity indicators is that they mostly focus on what's done at the supervision and practitioner levels. They're not focused on how caregivers and youth experience those changes or those practices. And there's a ton of them.
Right.
And so trying to figure out, okay, well, what are families and youth getting out of this? What's their experience of this? What's working for them or not working for them? It's really easy for that to get obscured within all of these indicators that are required of EBPs.
And additionally, to that point, though, Nate, having kind of worked in a role where as a mid-level purveyor for some of these, right? So there's only so much time in the day. There's only so much bandwidth to track things. And then there's a financial incentive to track fidelity, right? Because it's tied to ability to achieve payment. So some of those youth and family level outcomes fall by the wayside because you're overwhelmed by the amount of fidelity tracking around what the practitioner and the supervisor do.
Absolutely, right. It becomes like a trap where you get stuck in the process, and you get stuck in like trying to collect everything, get everything out, and manage everything, and instead like what your impact is, right? All is kind of like washed away as the most important thing. So easy for it to get lost, right?
Yeah.
So what we found in working across states, across providers, across systems, there are 4 things that seem to predict in behavioral health treatment better outcomes over time. And these 4 fundamentals are very consistent with the values and goals of TCOM. So by collaborative, we mean that this is that the work that you do is timely and responsive to people. It's timely, responsive, and informative. That is highly related to positive outcomes. We know that meeting consistently is also related to positive outcomes, because you have to be able to check in and reinforce things that are done well, and adjust the things, the practices or new skills that folks are trying that aren't working. To that end, engaging supporters both from the home and other environments, such as school or the community, appears to be the single strongest driver of outcome. And then the use of skills outside of treatment. So this includes both working on things that you'll practice outside of treatment, providing homework or opportunities to use those skills outside of treatment, and then checking in on those things. Also consistently predict improvements in functional outcomes. Okay.
So in looking at this too, I'm sure this may have occurred to you at some point, but that this is really an outcome-based version of that work Bruce George Pita did years ago, where he was just looking at those common elements within evidence-based practices and saying, well, since these show up the most frequently, we can use these. But your approach seems to say, well, what is the one that are connected to positive impact and to change? What are those practices, and can we align around those?
And you might want to frame this as that's a great insight, Mark, because what we're talking about is fidelity to effectiveness in a sense, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about what is the route to really making sure that folks are getting better. We're not simply saying, are these practices consistent across all these other things that people do, or all these other things that they've been taught to do, right? We're not asking that. What we're asking is, are these things driving improvements?
Right.
And it appears that they are. So here, we talk a lot about at the system level or at the program level that you can look at these things, and we have protocols for being able to do that. It's also true that you can use these indicators along with a series of questions that you can use to guide the interaction as at the individual level, to be able to say, is the care that this particular child and family is receiving, is it consistent with these fundamentals? Is it likely to actually be improving things that are important for them? And so we have on the website, and you can just go to tcom2024.com, and it will route you to our website, to a resources page that includes this tool and almost everything we talk about here today, so that you can use this at any level of your system, right? You can use this in terms of thinking about what happens with individual clients and families. You can use this at the individual clinician level in terms of all of the families they serve. You can use it for supervisors. You can use it for agencies and systems. So these indicators scale, which has been great to see. One of the things that we did was then to look at how practices seem to be distributed across these different cultural groups, right? And so when we were looking at practices in this system, we created this little dashboard, and these are three of the 4 indicators. We have another one for collaboration that, just in the interest of time, we're not showing here. But what we found here is that the youth from minority cultures are in the orange bars, and youth from majority cultures are in the blue bars. These youth from minority cultures were getting about half of the amount of weekly therapy hours as other kids, but the sessions themselves were actually almost twice as likely to be focused on skill building. So sessions they were getting, it seemed like it was consistent with what we would be hoping for, but wasn't happening at the consistency that we would want. And they were half as likely, or less than half as likely, to have supporters who were associated with them and being engaged in that work, right? So here we have a little bit of unevenness in these fidelity indicators. And this is the kind of thing that happens in real life when you actually start digging into these things, right? You just start to say, well, this is a complex pattern. How do I make sense of this, right? What do I need to do around this? And what do I actually act on? What changes the amount of weekly therapy hours that I get? What changes the percentage of sessions with a supporter? And for that, you can't simply rely on aggregate analyses. You have to go ask families and youth about their experience and care. So if this is the practices part with these indicators, the experiences part is absolutely critical. So what we do with both youth and caregivers, youth who are ages 14 and above, and then caregivers, is to ask a series of questions. We have these guided interviews where we ask them about their experiences in care, and then we also ask them about what was the emotion that they most associated with that part of the treatment process. And so we look at their initial access to care, what the assessment process was like, including the use of the CANs or any other TCOM tool that they used, what goal setting, selecting care, the actual work with the therapist or other treatment providers, how progress was reviewed so that it could be then adapted over time if they had crises and how those were handled, and then their transition from care. So we ask about each of these stages because we want to know where in this set of practices things are going well and where we might need to figure out how to do better. And in fact, what we found with kids from the majority culture is that if we looked at their experience of care, it was almost uniformly positive. There's a little bit of a few folks who indicated that the ability to select care that they wanted was not optimal. There were some folks who said when they were in crisis, the response that they received was not what they were looking for. Overall, very positive. When we looked at this for kids who weren't from majority cultures, in fact, what we found is a very different care pathway or care set of experiences. And what's most notable here is the unevenness.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if this care is this roller coaster of emotions or this yo-yo of emotions that they have associated with it. You'll notice that both at the beginning and at the end, the vast majority of caregivers and youth who we talked to had negative emotions associated with the care that they received. But there's one critically important caveat. If you look at these three processes that are on top of this line here, setting goals, the therapeutic alliance, and progress review, it's really consistent with the data that we saw earlier, right? Which said, hey, when I'm in therapy, it's really useful.
Yeah.
In therapy, we're working on things that matter. And in fact, when we asked about their experience of their therapist, nearly 100% positive, right? So if we were to then say, after working through this, that we need to change therapists' behaviors, we need to really change how they engage folks, we need to change how they get people to sessions, we're missing the point.
Yeah.
In fact, we should be celebrating what our therapists are doing, because what we're seeing is across cultural groups, across kids with what might be very different situations, they're doing work that is highly valued. So then what is it that actually needs to change? Well, it's these system processes that seem to be putting a ceiling on the effectiveness of the care. The ability to access services, the ability to access the care that you actually want, the ability to get care right away when you need it, and then the ability to feel like you have what you need as you leave. All those things are things that are essentially underwater in this process.
So, I mean, just on that point, right? So this kind of increasingly layered and nuanced thinking around how to think about systems reform or systems improvement, right? It is moving from this idea, well, we have failing or underperforming providers to successful providers, and so we're just going to make some shifts there to thinking about there is still success even in providers where there might be some underperformance, and trying to understand where that stuff is. And then if those processes are related to differences within the population itself, right? So yeah, keep going, because I'm curious, then I'll have another question towards the end, but like, how do you kind of make this concrete in a process?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've started to say right now already is if we want to make really useful, meaningful systems change for these families, if you're a system administrator, the first thing that you need to do is look internally, right? You need to start to say, what are our practices? What are our policies? What are our supports that we have in place around access to care, around our care continuum, around the way that we're providing crisis care and educating people about the resources associated with crisis care, and then about how we manage transitions, right? We need to start looking at policies and practices around those things right away. That's what I would start looking at. Okay. But we can go a layer deeper than that, right? We can start to say, because now we have these interviews with families and youth, and they can tell us specifically what happened that they did or didn't like.
Yeah.
Right. So we can start to be even more targeted in the way that we think about, well, what is it that we would need to change? And this does take a bit more nuance in the way that we approach things, right? It's not simply, hey, guess what? These providers are underperforming and they're going to get an EBP and they're going to like it, right? Which is the way it's, that's a really cartoonish way of describing systems change.
But it's not too far. I mean, I think a lot of it, it's a little bit more in depth. But a lot of it boils down to what did people get and what didn't they get, right? So, and you can kind of think about that from, at least I've seen this happen over and over, from a practice standpoint. Well, did they get this or did they not get this? And that, what you're really getting at is what was their experience of this, which is the important factor.
And how is it that our system is actually creating these experiences, right? So how is it that it is getting people prepared for care, providing them with the options that they really care about, and then helping them in the toughest times and then as they transition. So these are direct quotes from people we talk to, as a youth saying, in terms of access, at first I felt nervous and anxious about going to counseling. It actually took quite a while to actually go into the counseling. So you have something that's festering for a while there that they don't feel comfortable or they don't know how to access help around, right? When you talk to the kids who and their caregivers who indicated that their experience was really positive, they said, oh, well, you know what? When anybody noticed that there was a problem, it didn't take that long, right? They were calling, the school was calling, you had supportive adults around them. They knew he had an issue with bullying. Okay, the school helped get an appointment too, as soon as possible, right? You had a set of adults there who were noticing that something was a concern. And as soon as they noticed, they didn't stop there. They took action on that. So there was something that made it easy for them to see, well, what's the route to help, right? Whereas for this kid over here on the left, the chance that nobody noticed that there was a concern, likely low, right? Somebody noticed, likely, but there wasn't clarity around what to do next. Okay, well, let's look at a little deeper into that. For some folks, what they're saying in terms of their experience, which was negative, it was impossible to access services, couldn't find anything that helped. His needs were really big, right? So there's a complexity to it. There's an overwhelm to it. And the person said, it's really important that I'm connected to the right person, not just somebody with availability on their calendar. Right? So what we're starting to see is accessing services is, of course, about how timely it is, but it's also about, well, who's a good fit for this youth? And can you find somebody who seems like a good fit? And part of what we're talking about is somebody who they're not encountering the types of concerns that this youth has for the very first time. And it might also be right here, it appears that they're alluding to is that there are probably multiple types of supports that might be useful, right? And in fact, in some of the unpacking that we do, that's one of the things that we find most consistently, is that the type of support that you're trying to get is not just unidimensional, right? It's not just one thing that would be helpful. And here we have another description of things that got in the way of actually having a positive experience, where people were gatekeeping the ability to get access to a psychiatrist. They literally put a substantial barrier up even after the person was accepted for services at that agency. Whereas for folks who are indicating that that their access experience was very positive, what happens is that the agency has entirely eliminated the barrier to care, right? It's not that we said you have to do something else to be able to get care. We will arrive on your doorstep to provide that care. Right? And so they're like flipped experiences of what it takes to be able to get the care. So part of what we're seeing is trying to find ways to notice, route, and eliminate barriers to care, right? All right. So we could summarize that by saying, okay, well, what are the things that make access to care something that is currently associated with negative emotions? Well, no one reaches out to address concerns. Services that are identified are not a good fit. They're not helpful. They're not intensive enough. They're not what we were looking for. Attempts to access services are met with gatekeeping and additional requirements that take families who are already overwhelmed and remind them that they have to work even harder if they're going to get something. Right? Instead, in a system that's effective, adults notice and act on youth's worries and concerns quickly, that services are provided consistent with what you need. And in fact, providers are proactively working to reach out to you and eliminate any barriers to being able to use that service in a meaningful way. Okay. So what you start to have is this flip, and what you would be in a practice or systems change experience here, what you would be looking to do is to see, okay, are there things in our policies and procedures that are creating the situation on the left?
Right.
Are there things in our policies and procedures that facilitate the things on the right? Right? How do we amplify those things that might be working and creating what's happening on the right, these desirable experiences? And how do we put in place supports so that those experiences on the left don't recur? Right?
I'd be curious too, and in thinking about this new approach to systems improvement work, and really just to, I know we're running low on time, but just to describe the level of collaboration you need from the kind of state level system to all the system partners, including, I would imagine, provider agencies would have to be fully on board with this shift and moving this direction. And what are the costs and benefits of doing that?
Yeah, people don't have to be fully on board to start with. What you're working to do throughout this process is to bring people along. So this sense making can't just be what I, as an outside consultant, believe is the story here, right? This sense making has to come along the way with your partners, with providers, with folks in the system, and those are uncomfortable meetings. Let's be frank about it, right? Because some of the time, those are meetings where we talk about strengths, we talk about things that are working, And this approach is designed to surface those strengths, right? And you start with them and you want to build on them. You also say, hey, there's some experiences that are happening relatively consistently with this group of people who this is not consistent with our values. This is not consistent with what's going to help them. So how do we change those? What do we do that's different about that? And so what you're looking to do in this process is to get rid of the apprehension that people on both ends of that effectiveness continuum have, right? That,
Right.
oh my gosh, you're going to sweep away my effective practice, right? And instead, we're saying, no. When kids and families have identified that there's a practice that's working, we're looking to amplify and support that, right? When kids and families have identified that there are things that are not working, and in this case, what we see is the hard work of therapists is in fact being undermined by some of these system processes that are either allowed to happen or that are explicitly put into place, right? Then people start to see that, oh my gosh, well, accountability is there on every level. And what we're really focusing on is what works and how we help kids and families. And so for a system that's bought into using this approach, it could be transformative for the system, right? Because you're looking to build trust across folks as you do this work. And you're approaching it in a way that many people have not experienced in the entirety of their careers. So you're right. People might be apprehensive to begin with. People might be concerned to begin with, but it really is built around transformation that is rooted in collaboration, that's rooted in the value that we hold most dear, which is that we are in this work to help people. And when we are not doing things that help people, we're willing to look at that honestly and to change. Right? And that surfaces that in ways that are that some people I think really celebrate and get really excited about, even though it takes effort. And so that's how we want to shift this from this frustrating, many times top-down approach to change to something that really is inclusive and collaborative.
All right. So you've given us a lot to think about. I think we could probably keep this conversation going for another 45 minutes. But I do want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and kind of share your ideas with us. I think this, for systems that are been using TCOM tools and trying to shift their focus to say, how does this impact our practice, instead of starting with or ending with outcomes, to say, can we understand tracking our outcomes, are we better or not, and saying, starting with outcomes to think about how we do practice improvement and systems reform. I think it's a welcome addition to kind of the newer thinking around how these tools can be beneficial. So thank you for sharing all that stuff, and it's good to see you as always.
I appreciate you taking the time and having me on the show, Mark. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Your website, again, just so folks can get those resources, was tcom2024.com. Please feel free to visit Nate's website. Thank you all for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. We'll be back in a month with our next guest, Dr. Allison Cromp from Four Pines. For more information on that episode, please follow us on Instagram and track us on the TCOM blog, tcomconversations.org. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Connecting the Dots. Thanks.